Let's go back in time to 1932 as Converse brings you historic footage of the legendary original Celtics, with whom all great professional teams are compared.
We have now taken over your radio.
Reggie is about to show you the most important step in getting past a man. It's the first one.
And Oscar will inbound it. The men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks, that's Alcindor against Bellamy.
Has Jordan. Allen shakes. Gray gets two.
Gilmore on
Stop. Oh, brother.
lead. Toledo artists, you get 21.
4:28 to go in the first quarter for the Cow Palace. Here's Barry.
Jordan. Open. Chicago with the lead.
Hello and welcome back to the Over and Back Classic NBA podcast at HowardProcessing.com. I am Jason Mann, and with me is my partner in crime, Rich Craich. Rich, great to be back with you.
Absolutely.
And we are going to talk about it's sort of a topic that's in the news a little bit with Kobe Bryant having officially announced his retirement in his 20th season. We're going to look back at some of the other all-time greats, all-time franchise players, look at sort of how they went out. Some of them went out with these farewell tours. Some of them went out just having announced it, but being a little more low-key. Some of them didn't bother to announce until after they were done. So we're just kind of looking at some of the other legends of basketball history and kind of comparing how those receptions were to how Kobe is being received this year.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing in sports right now because for a lot of people, and at least I've always sort of thought that is in recent, because I'm a big baseball fan, so of course a lot of the stuff going on with Derek Jeter and Mariano Rivera of them retiring over the past 5 years or whatever, it's been a lot of this. Or Chipper Jones is another one too that I remember got like every place he went, everybody was doing all this sort of stuff, and people kind of assume that it's sort of this brand new thing in sports, and I think it's been ramped up a little bit more. The like, okay, retiring legends coming to our hometown, so here's all this stuff, but it's not completely new. It's not like as of 5 years ago this started. There's examples of it in history. It might be a little more ramped up now, but a guy like Kobe is one where, like, there were some people, and I'm sure there's going to be in the next decade or whatever, there's going to be people that are like, yeah, that guy's like just kind of okay, you know what I mean? Like, he doesn't deserve this, but a guy of Kobe's stature, I'm okay with that. It seems like the NBA does it only when it's like guys of ridiculously worthy stature, whereas baseball sometimes can get a little tricky with that, but we'll talk about it when we do.
Yeah.
it, so.
Well, that kind of speaks to the difference in the NBA to baseball as well, because like baseball, even the most important players like have like a limited, serve a limited role.
Yeah. Like Mariano Rivera is the greatest closer of all time, but it's like, well,
he pitches in the ninth inning, and
right. I mean, like, he's the all-time,
really, yeah.
He's the best failed starter of all time. Like, that's really cool.
Sure,
like,
yeah. And whereas in basketball, the true franchise players really have, a huge impact in all aspects of the game.
Like Kobe is a transcendent, like Kareem is a transcendent guy. Like guys we're going to talk about here are like transcendent sort of guys where, and like I got it with Jeter was one that I got it as well. I think from maybe not from a, his baseball skills, arguable. I mean, he's obviously a very all-time great player or whatever. Is he an all-time like legendary top, whatever, you can argue that or whatever, but still with the glamour of being in New York, the championships and all that sort of stuff, you get it. And there are a few of these guys we'll talk about here in a little bit, but yeah, I think it is a little bit easier with basketball to just sort of say that is the guy. You know what I mean? Like Kobe Bryant is an all-time, like a legendary all-time great. And at the moment that they're retiring too. Yeah. Which is pretty cool too. It doesn't really take much to figure it out that,
and that's
this guy's special.
That's kind of a fame versus value thing. And with Kobe, there's definitely a lot of both.
Well, the Economist told me that Kobe Bryant wasn't very good at basketball. So
I mean, I guess the Economist was a little bit, I feel like the headlines was...
The headline was like, Kobe Bryant, really not that good at basketball. The headline's like, he's really good, but is he like the best ever?
Yeah,
like
it's like... a little, I mean, I feel like we basically agree on Kobe as like, he's probably in like he's somewhere like in the 10 to 20 range, probably, of all time great players.
Yeah. And I'm not like, of course, people know me as the prototypical Kobe hater or whatever. But no, it's inarguable that he's top 20, top 25 all time.
Yeah. Probably not top 10 for me, but I mean,
I don't know if he'd be my top 10.
If you want to throw in,
I'm going to get a lot of people very upset.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to make that argument, I'm not going to say like it's ridiculous.
It's not out of the world. Yeah, if you're going to say the best of all time, you're probably out of your world.
Yeah,
but
I know,
but
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we talked earlier in previous shows. One of our season preview type show where we kind of talked about the idea of like Kobe, like wanting to have a purpose for Kobe. Like that was kind of what we were sort of hoping for as basketball fans, for him to kind of go out with a purpose. And now that he's actually officially announced his retirement, and then he's leaving, to acclaim from every crowd that he goes to, it's sort of the last time you get to see Kobe versus this team or in this city or in this situation or whatever. I think it does add a little bit, it does sort of, as a fan of basketball, but not specifically a fan of the Lakers or Kobe, it still adds a little bit more satisfaction of like, oh, okay, now I feel like I at least need to watch this from a point of view of like, this is the last time I'm going to be able to watch, one of the most important players in NBA history. And even though, performance wise, it's really bad. I mean, it's really, really, really bad.
We're going to go through some guys here who actually, I was actually surprised at the number of guys who, it is not all that awful their last year, but the Kobe's kind of embarrassingly awful right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had a good game, so he kind of kicked that shooting percentage up a little bit, but it was under 30%. Just
the threes. What is he doing?
Yeah, it's weird. It's sort of like it's an odd dynamic of it's 306 shooting percentage, 219 from 3-point percentage. This will be released a little bit after we've done this podcast, so obviously that'll be updated a little bit. But whatever. I do not think he's going to go on such a tear that the point is going to be there. So we've talked about this before as well, as like, okay, we are very near the end of Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Dirk Nowitzki, Paul Pierce, all these legends, Vince Carter, all these guys who started around the same time, within a year or two of each other, and have had these like crazy long careers that are nearly unprecedented in NBA history. I mean, only a handful of players before this generation have had guys who have lasted 18, 19, 20 years, and now we've got a bunch of these guys together, and they're all probably going to go out within a year or two or three of each other. It's going to be interesting to see how Kobe going out versus, Garnett goes out, Duncan, Dirk, whether these guys go out with like a lot of acclaim, whether people are going to know ahead of time, or whether they're just going to, or whether they're just going to, it's going to be it. I mean, it's kind of gone back and forth with all the legends in NBA history. We're going to talk about some of them. But
which, before we get to those, which do you prefer from a standpoint, or is it different based off the player?
I like it ahead of time. I kind of like the pageantry. I kind of like the, the ability to celebrate their career and ability to kind of have the story behind it of this being kind of the farewell tour. Even though Kobe is like, they've requested like no gifts, and they've tried to like tone down some aspects of that. But I mean, I think the only real reason to announce this is to at least have, to have the goodbye in to a certain degree, or take the pressure off the organization or whatever, just to kind of, admit, okay, this is actually it. I kind of prefer it being open, although I understand players who don't want that to be a distraction or to be a thing. So, I mean, I think either one is fine, but as a fan, I prefer to kind of know and to be able to celebrate in the moment.
I used to be the opposite. I used to think, because I hated the pageantry and that sort of stuff, and the pregame gifts and all that sort of stuff. But sort of as I've gotten older, and I think I've gotten to the point now where a lot of the guys that are retiring, like, I think it's a very personal thing where now a lot of those guys, like half the names you mentioned before, guys like Vince Carter and Dirk specifically are like two of my all-time favorites, and I have such like fond memories of them that I would almost, knowing that it's going to be Dirk's final game in Chicago or whatever, will make it so, and I try to go no matter what, but that would be like, no matter what, I have to go and see that. You know what I mean? And like, I have to watch all these games, and I got to appreciate it a little bit more. Whereas, if he didn't, I might kind of take it for granted and not really maybe watch as much, not go if he's in town and that sort of stuff. And that's, as I've gotten older, I've sort of appreciated the idea that, hey, it's pretty cool to have that sort of closure Whereas, if he just out of nowhere retired after last year or whatever, and I was like, oh no, I didn't get to see that, I'd almost feel kind of, I don't know, I'd feel like let down, or like I didn't get to have my closure with that, or there's different things like that. So I'm on board with now knowing, and I think sometimes the gifts and that sort of stuff can get a little too over the top or whatever, but it doesn't really bother me like it maybe used to. For whatever reason, it did bother me, but I'm okay with it now. And we'll talk about one of these guys here, but I was watching video of one of the guys, the last game or whatever, and you have no idea, and he doesn't really, I don't know if he knows, and the crowd kind of knows but does, and it's just like kind of awkward and weird, and it's like, I think it would just be good if everybody knew, hey, this is it for that guy. But yeah, I'm on board with knowing ahead of time as well now.
Yeah, and I think it makes a difference whether this player is like on the franchise, he's been on that team for his entire career, most of his career, or at least is like best known for that franchise. That the way, that kind of way of saying goodbye in front of like the fans that are kind of your main fans. I think that makes a difference versus a guy like Pierce or Carter are unlikely to have that kind of send off to their
right.
career.
Yeah, like Memphis isn't going to give like where the hell is Vince Carter?
He's Memphis
still, right? Yeah.
So
and that's like that's
I mean,
I don't even remember where he's at.
Unless Pierce somehow went back to Boston for a spell,
right.
or I don't Carter, I guess.
Well, that's what's cool about the KG thing. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, exactly.
Minnesota, but
I mean, he's back in Minnesota, and we talked about him kind of having that purpose as like that mentor and sort of embracing that and sort of. Like that's. I mean, he's by far the most important player in their franchise history. So to have him back, that's a meaning for a franchise is not. That's
and from a team standpoint too. It's you mentioned from a roster building standpoint. It's good to know. Okay, just scratch him off the books for next year. Now we can build with you kind of have closure on that end. But also there's also it's kind of in some way sort of exploitative, but now that that they're retiring, you can do a lot more of that season. You can have the bobblehead day, the t-shirt, you can market it a little bit more, which, in one respect is kind of like shady and icky or whatever, but in some, it's kind of cool. Like Paul Konerko for the White Sox, I'm a big, Chicago White Sox fan or whatever. He retired, I think 2 years ago at this point. And like every weekend there was something going on that was Paul Konerko related. You get a bobblehead one day, you get this, and it gave a reason to go to the stadium, even with the team is no good. Like, and that I think is always kind of cool with NBA teams too, where you're like, what, hey, this team's no good, but it's my last time seeing this guy, or it's my last time seeing Kobe Bryant. So in that respect, it's kind of cool, or you can get giveaways and that stuff. So yeah, I'm all on board with it.
Yeah, and I'm sure Lakers fans feel that way. I mean, I'm sure that there's value in having the ability to kind of say goodbye to Kobe and know that you're saying goodbye to Kobe, and being able to sort of enjoy it, even if maybe the aesthetics of how he's playing.
If you have to put acid in your eyes when you're
when
you leave the game, but other than that, it's
I mean, I think there's at least like now you can get something out of like the crowd reactions on the road when they're getting excited for him to be there or chant MVP or whatever. He is one of these very, very few like transcendent like across the league type stars who really like.
Oh no! In any city he goes, there's a huge pocket of Kobe Bryant.
Yeah, I mean,
like, guaranteed. There's not one city here that doesn't have hundreds of thousands of Kobe Bryant fans.
Sure.
So.
I mean, I there are, and the list of players who really make a difference on that level is very small. So, even the other guys we talked about, KG, Dirk, and Duncan, as great as they are and as important as they are to the history of the game, they don't really have that same sort of appeal for the most part. So, So, should we get into the players we're going to talk about?
Let's do it.
All right, we're going to start with Michael Jordan. You might have heard of him.
Mm-hmm.
He, of course, he spent most of his career with the Chicago Bulls, but after retiring after having won 6 championships, 2 three-peats, spent a couple years out of the league, then got involved in the ownership of the Washington Wizards and decided, hey, you know what, I'll come back. And played for a couple more seasons. And I don't know, this is sort of considered like a huge like historical mistake, or like I don't know about like a ruining of a legacy, but definitely like a detraction of his legacy. But he didn't really. I mean, he didn't play that bad. I mean, he
wasn't. Yeah, and that's what's always kind of funny about those is and at the time I remember that being the big talking point. Oh my God, what is Jordan doing? Oh my God, it's so embarrassing. Oh my God, he can't do anything he used to do or whatever. But then when you look down to it, I mean, the teams didn't win, and maybe that's the biggest thing of his legacy is like that everybody had that mystique that anytime Jordan steps on the floor, his team is automatically in title contention or going to win a title. And that, for many, many years, that was the case. But, with the Wizards, it wasn't that. But on the court, he wasn't. I mean, he was pretty damn good. I mean, he had lost most of the athleticism, but he could still shoot. I remember he had that little drop step fadeaway thing that he would just hit on everybody. And it's like, he got in the gym and then probably said, okay, look, I can't do what I did at all. But, he wasn't that much different than what the Jordan was on the last, Bulls team. I mean, that was a Jordan that was radically different than the Jordan that was on the 91 Bulls. You know what I mean? Sure. Like if you watch those two Jordans, they're not that, they're not similar at all. And I think the final, three-peat Jordan, at least the last year, 98 Jordan, is not a whole lot different than the one you got with the Wizards. He was just a little bit older, a little bit more, out of shape. But yeah, his final season was actually pretty good. His first one back, he had a decent amount of struggles, but this one, his final one, I mean, he didn't go out like a whimper. I mean, he played all 82 games, started 67 of them. He had 20 points per game, which was the career low, but he was second on the team of the Wizards. It was not a great Wizards team at that time. It was like Jerry Stackhouse was on there and a few other guys. But yeah, second on the team with 20 points per game. 44.5% from the field, which is not bad at all, considering, his shots weren't very close to the rim. They were very, kind of mid-range heavy. 6.2 win shares, 0.099 win shares per 48. I mean, not great numbers, but certainly not bad. Like not unplayable.
Not like he was embarrassing himself. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's not 6.2 win share is not embarrassing. I mean, it's not like that. And then, his usage was the highest on the team at 28.7. So he was taking up a lot of possessions, but with that team, it really wasn't. I mean, I suppose Jerry Stackhouse, I think he was second, probably could have used a few more of those possessions, but it wasn't a big deal. And that team wasn't very good anyway, but yeah, certainly did not embarrass himself at all. I mean, famously sort of, knocked his point per game totals down almost to real bad levels, in terms of not going to be an all-time great or whatever. But still, when it all said and done, I mean, the guy was great, and it didn't affect his career all that much. I mean, I think we talk about it a little too much as it being an embarrassment. It's really not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on how you view Jordan when you experience Jordan. Like, if you think of if you kind of came of age in the early 90s, or when Jordan was completely dominant, the Bulls completely dominated the league, and basically if Jordan was there, they couldn't lose type of thing. If you have that Jordan in your head, then I think it's a big fall from that. If you take Jordan's entire career, the first 8 years when, they had a lot of team struggles, even though he had individual brilliance, and, they were knocking at the door forever. And, if you kind of take into Jordan being great, but not necessarily immortal, in the same way of of Bill Russell, let's say, of the team success on, I mean, then I think this fits more in with just okay, well, this is just an aging great, still great, but not quite as great. And, this is keeping more in line with the early part of his career. So I think it kind of depends on when you got into Jordan and when you, when you came of age as an NBA fan. He did start playing on the bench. It was because he started as a sixth man. It was because of you kind of wanted to save himself, but then injuries sort of put him back in the starting lineup. And this was really the only time he was able to actually say goodbye, to fans, or fans were, I guess, more able to say goodbye to him while he was still playing. I mean, the other two retirements, the first came after, his father had been murdered, and it was just, in a press conference over the summer. The second time was after the lockout had ended in early '99, and it was at an event at the United Center, but it was it wasn't during a game. It was there was a strong feeling that when they won the '98 championship, that was probably going to be it, and that was certainly going to be it for the Bulls team being together. Whether Jordan would continue was I think considered unlikely, but was less, certain. So, but this was a definitive way of saying goodbye. It was announced before, the end of the season. He had he was, I think Vince Carter, deferred so that Jordan could take his place as starter in the All-Star game. And Jordan hit what was like a game-winning shot, although it ended up being negated. The shot would counter, but then other things happened that ended up not making it the game winner.
Who was the go to that? I remember there was somebody that felt really bad.
Kobe got fouled, and Kobe was mad that that the refs had called the foul, and then he made the foul shots, and it tied, and then it went to overtime. And I
forgot who the guy that fouled Kobe afterwards, but he was like so apologetic and stuff after the game. I just remember that vividly in my mind. Like it was like, this is a farce of a game. Like everybody's upset that the game went on, and like things. It was just kind of funny in that respect. I forgot who it was. It was somebody.
I'm not sure.
It was some klutzy guy too, and it was like somebody that you're like, yeah, of course that was the guy who did it or whatever. It was like, no, don't foul him. Damn it, like Antoine Walker, someone like that. I forgot who, but it's probably Antoine Walker. But.
We'll just go ahead and blame him. So
yeah,
anyone wants to let us know for at Over and Back NBA on Twitter, you can let us know. So yeah, I mean he had 3 40-point games that season, including a 43-point game against the Nets that came 4 days after his 40th birthday, which means he's the only player over the age of 40 to have a 40-point game in NBA history. And Jack McCollum,
Jermaine O'Neal, got it. Sorry, I couldn't.
O'Neal, there you go.
Resist.
All right.
Resist.
But Jermaine is not quite that much of a klutz, but
no, he's not very much of a klutz. But I remember him being very apologetic afterwards.
Well, yeah. I mean, imagine basically everyone in that game was like worshipped Jordan as a kid. So, I mean, that must be, that would be an odd feeling. I mean, I get a lot of them are used to playing against him, but still, I mean, it's his last one. It makes a difference. So, McCall, wait a minute. No, that doesn't make any sense because O'Neal, he would have been with the Pacers by then, right?
Yeah, he was a Pacer. So, yeah, he followed Kobe Bryant.
Okay, yeah. Right, yeah. Okay, never mind. So Jack McCollum wrote a piece that's in the SI Vault. Michael Jordan going out in style is what it's called. And the quote there is, when you play the Washington Wizards, you're not playing a mediocre team battling to make the playoffs in the mediocre Eastern Conference. You're playing Michael Jordan on his last go-around, and that means something. So, that's into purpose, obviously, that, we're kind of feeling with Kobe now. And there is a famous Washington City paper article. I guess it's sort of actually a series of articles written by a bunch of different people. And it's really like it's a pretty scathing look at sort of like the cynical nature of Jordan being in Washington and sort of like the after hours look and the entourage around him and like him sort of like living his youth like in the clubs and things like that, just sort of like setting like a Jordan scene as like sort of a pathetic old man. And it's really, we'll have to include it in the links if we get a chance, because that's a pretty famous piece and just sort of it's not all super negative, but there's enough of it that's pretty strongly negative that's but it does paint a picture of kind of how he was viewed at the end there, of just sort of like this being a little bit of like a sad coda to the end of his career. So the quote from that is, for one hot shooting quarter or one night at a club, you could still pretend that Michael Jordan was Michael Jordan, but it couldn't last. Step back and he was just another Wizards or Bullets short timer with a funny backstory. Rex Chapman or Manute Bol. He was just another businessman watching things go sour with the boss. So, and after this, in fact, he was fired as team president by Abe Pollin, the owner of the Wizards, which Jordan sort of viewed as a betrayal. But Jordan didn't have necessarily the best record as an executive. He would sort of argue, well, we're kind of rebuilding here. I did some things that enabled us. They were able to sign Gilbert Arenas thanks to some of the cap space he cleared. So, but he did draft Kwame Brown, and not a great run for him, but he sort of felt like, okay, I went here and played, and now I should have this position, and then it didn't really work out. But then, he ended up buying the Charlotte Bobcats, and the rest is history.
The championships came.
Yes.
They came swiftly.
Yes, swiftly indeed. So obviously one highlight of this final year was the emotional goodbye that he had in Chicago.
Yeah. So of course that's kind of probably the most famous game of his retirement tour or whatever. Yeah, went to Chicago. They had a famous thing. They announced him. It wasn't like too over the top, but they put in the from North Carolina, similar to the introduction he would get as a member of the Bulls, but I've got it as the Wizards. Received I think like a 4-minute standing ovation or something like that. He had to get a microphone to finally be like, all right, thank you, like stop talking. And then like I remember watching on TV at the time, and they the Bulls, because they always turn the lights out to do like the intros. They turned the lights out and everybody just booed. And that was the best part, because it was like now the Bulls players are just getting booed mercifully as they're coming out to their own team, and like it's pretty funny. But yeah, that was sort of one of the funny things. And there's a good article, an ESPN recap actually talking about it, and it said, here's a quote. Though Jordan swears this is his last season, so still it was kind of funny that there's a little bit of like, he says it's his last season, but is he really true? But it, of course it would be. So the Bulls canceled the pregame ceremony they had originally planned because Jordan said he didn't want the traveling farewell tour. He had specifically said, I just want, do whatever you want for me, but I don't want the full tour. I don't want all this sort of stuff. So interesting enough, but it was pretty cool. Jordan quotes in that story, we both had a chance to say goodbye. Let's move on to the rest of the season and move on in life. So Jordan was ready to go to the next level. And then Marcus Fizer, then Chicago Bull Marcus Fizer, had a great quote. He's always going to be Michael Jordan no matter what. In 3 or 4 years, he could be 300 or 400 pounds, and he's still going to be Michael Jordan.
He could have Hitler mustache.
Yeah, little did he know, little did Marcus Fizer know that Michael Jordan would take him up on that 300 pounds.
He could wear extremely baggy jeans, I mean, he could, he could do anything, he's still Michael Jordan.
If you saw Jordan in the 90s, you could kind of understand that he probably would have terrible
the
fashion come.
Wasn't good.
Because in the 90s, like he wore bad stuff, but it was like,
the 90s.
The 90s,
yeah, right.
Yeah, you could tuck your sweater into like corduroys. No one will care. Sure. That's great. Yeah. Like that's really cool. But yeah, then he like never evolved past that. And it's still like, you're still wearing that like the golf hat, huh? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, that's all right. But Marcus Fizer there. Yeah. But that was probably his most famous, game of his retirement tour. But,
and it's worth noting that the Bulls were absolutely terrible for like 5 or 6 years after Jordan left. I mean, they were trying to do kind of a 76ers style rebuild. I mean, all young players. Mm-hmm. And they kind of rebooted that after a couple years, and then it did really until like 2005 they were not very good at all.
Right.
So
can you imagine the internet outrage now if they if a team traded Elton Brand like after his rookie year? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like the Bulls literally had a guy, Elton Brand, who had won Rookie of the Year, was scoring 22 points a game, like a reliable guy, and they traded him for an 18.
Was it after 1 year or 2 years? I thought
it was 2 years. He had 2 years there. I just meant like after being, he was named Rookie of the Year.
Right.
Obviously came back, had a good season.
Yes.
Yeah, and then like 2 years. I mean, he's what 22, 23 at most at that point, and they trade it. I mean, like, can you imagine the outrage?
And that trade was for Tyson Chandler, right?
It's Tyson Chandler.
They drafted Eddie Curry and they signed Tyson.
They drafted Curry and then traded Brand to the Clippers for Chandler. Yeah. Can you even imagine?
Who didn't really work out that well in Chicago? Obviously, later stages in his career did very well, but Chicago was sort of an up and down situation for him. But so next we'll talk about I don't know, one of the two most famous retirement tours for me, and these are kind of linked together. Julius Erving, who retired in the 1987 season, this is the first one that I was aware of where it was like, okay, you're going to all these different cities, you're getting these gifts from each of the teams, and and the fans are saying goodbye to you. And it's interesting to kind of see how like he was viewed at the time. I mean, he's still viewed as like a great player, one of the greats of all time, maybe, but not necessarily like the best player of like the 70s and the 80s. Like I mean,
he doesn't seem transcendent. No, I mean, like I love him. I think he's great, but like he doesn't quite strike me as a guy that deserves. A lot of pageantry.
I think he deserved it fine at the time, but it's just like, now like the way I feel like he is not viewed as like, he's not like a top 10. He's not viewed as a top 10 greatest player of all time, mm-hmm. like that. Like this, like that would warrant the streamers. I guess in those terms, I guess maybe it seems overstated in a way.
In terms of his numbers that year, played in 60 games and he started each one of those. He had a career low 16.8 point per game, 4.4 rebounds per game, shot 47.1%, so still not bad. 3.5 win shares, 0.088 win shares per 48, and both those were also career lows. So, I mean, not like an awful showing, but not I mean, it was obvious that this was the worst of the Julius Erving. It's not. It was probably time to go at this point. I mean, this wasn't a terrible year, but it looked like he had pretty much checked out, or not checked out, but everything that he had was pretty well gone at this point. Yeah. But he was able to kind of rely on still some of the innate skills that he had. But a lot of the flash and flair was pretty well gone.
Yeah, and the Sixers at this point were they were sort of a middling playoff team. They ended up losing in the first round to the Bucks. They seem to play the Bucks basically in every year, but they had traded Moses Malone for Jeff Ruland, and Andrew Toney was basically at the end of his career. Barkley had come in and was obviously taking like a larger share, but they were, the previous season was kind of like the last hurrah for like that, the Moses Malone centered Sixers, began obviously in 83 with the championship and then had, some deep playoff runs, through 86. They lost a 7-game semifinals to the Bucks in 86. So, so they had a strong, they had deep playoff runs through that point, and then by 87, they were lower tier, and then they would kind of start rebuilding after that, for the most part, around Barkley, which didn't work out. But at that point, he actually had the third most points of all time, NBA and ABA, behind Kareem and Wilt Chamberlain. I mean, he had, I think he just went over 30,000 points for his career. So, I mean, you think on that scale, it's like the third greatest scorer of all time.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that's obviously a great accomplishment. So, and had been the guy who helped popularize the slam dunk. In fact, another thing that sort of illustrates kind of his importance is that in the May 4th, 1987 issue of Sports Illustrated, there were 7 articles on Erving's retirement. Some of them were shorter, but I mean, they were all decent length, articles. I mean, they were, obviously it was part of like a big center spread type thing, but, Frank Deford, the very famous Sports Illustrated writer, wrote for a long time. He, about Erving's legacy, he wrote, basketball is now a much more artistic game than it was before, than any game was before because of Julius Erving. The slam, before the doctor, was essentially an act of power. A stuff is what it was usually called. As great giants jammed the ball through the hoop, Erving transformed the stuff into the dunk and made what had been brutal and a product of size into something beautiful and a measure of creativity. So, and I also talked about like being like, not only one of the greatest players ever, but also like one of the kindest and nicest people to ever deal with, like just amazingly so. And I guess part of the reason why he was sent off in such a such a hurrah. So, and then McCollum, Jack McCollum, writing for they called it the Doc Across America Tour. This of course was well, maybe not of course, because a lot of people probably have no idea what this is, but Hands Across America. Do you know Hands Across America was?
I do, yes.
Okay, well there you go. Well, yeah, Hands Across America.
Pretty much only from like The Simpsons.
Oh, well there you go. Yeah. So I remember. I'm almost remember when Hands Across America was something that like was like a big deal and was like talked about. It was like with the 100th anniversary of the Statue of Liberty and had been restored, and then like part of that was like a I guess the idea was that everyone was going to hold hands across the entire like United States, like they were gonna, or at least like in sections of it. So,
did you hold hands?
I don't believe so. No, I don't remember that. Oh. So I got some
way to break the chain.
I got some cool. Special statue.
Ohio was empty.
I guess Ohio was empty. Well, I did get some special Statue of Liberty themed coins from my great grandparents, which I still have. So that was pretty cool. Anyway, so he talked about how Doc would always do the right thing on any of these tour stops. Like in Seattle on November 11th, he asked the crowd to pause and remember that it was Veterans Day. In Boston on March 29th, he seamlessly read the inscription on a commemorative plaque after Celtic president Red Auerbach had forgotten to do so. In New Jersey on April 3rd, he came apart with just the right measure of emotion when his old ABA Nets jersey, number 32, was lowered from the Raptors. At Madison Square Garden on April 6th, he greeted Star Trek's Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy with a Vulcan salute. So,
nerd.
Yeah, well, there you go. So
nerdlinger,
adept at any situation. So there's a pretty good YouTube clip of like some of the highlights from Doc's retirement tour, which is worth checking out if you have never seen it. So, and next is one that I had not really known that much about up until kind of doing some of the research for. I was aware that he had sort of a fairly famous retirement ceremony, but as far as the actual tour, I hadn't know much about that. It was John Havlicek for the Boston Celtics. He retired in the 1978 season, and this is interesting to me because this is obviously just before Magic and Bird come in, and the entire nature of the NBA changes. But the NBA, obviously the early stars, for the most part, at least as far as I'm aware of, none of them really got this kind of send off because right. Either the league just hadn't had like a tradition and a history yet to sort of warrant it, or most of the players before Havlicek, they had not necessarily announced their retirement ahead of time. It was a after the season type of decision. So Havlicek did announce his ahead of time, and this is the first that I'm aware of like kind of this sort of like tour that Erving had where he'd go to the different cities and they would give him different gifts. And a piece from Kirkpatrick talks about this and says that recently certain critics have rudely knifed through Havlicek's career-long diplomatic immunity to question the propriety of his personally orchestrated final trek through the league, wherein at every stop he has been accorded hosannas and rewarded with enough appliances to fill backstage at The Price is Right. One man went so far as to remark that attracting a full house by the presentation of an oversized soft pretzel trophy, tasty cakes, and a 10-pound salami, a few of the 76ers' chosen gifts, was not exactly a fitting monument to Havlicek. So, I like that.
I'll take that big pretzel, though.
That was nice. Yeah. So,
can you eat the the pretzel trophy? Or is it an edible soft pretzel trophy? Is it a trophy made out of soft pretzel?
I mean, yeah, that's an excellent question. I was assuming it was
like, is there glue on it, or like?
I was assuming that it was a trophy shaped in a soft pretzel and not an actual soft pretzel. But
that's yeah.
We'll
I don't
see
know.
if we'll
have to get Curtis Harris on the
there you
the
go.
horn to see
if
he can officially let us know if it was a soft pretzel or a pretzel shaped trophy.
If anyone would know, I would imagine that Curtis would know.
Exactly, that's the type of thing.
So, in Havlicek, he had, I think this was his 15th season. He was in his late 30s. He had set longevity records in the league. So, was still a pretty good performer in his final season. Not what he was in his prime. The Celtics that year were a team that had struggled after having had obviously the great 60s run, and even after Russell retired, they were still, they won 2 championships and had, a standout run in the 70s that basically ended in Havlicek's last season.
Yeah, the year isn't too bad. He plays in all 82 games, which is quite fitting for Mr. Havlicek. 16.1 points per game, 4 rebounds per game, 4 assists per game. Shoots 44.9%. From the field. Not bad at all. 5.1 win shares and a .087 win shares per 48. That win shares per 48 was his career low, but the win shares were not his career low. They were actually about as good as he had done, any of his first 5 years of his career. Yeah. So that not bad. I mean, he's definitely, not a total slouch at all. And that's kind of one of the fun themes of going through this is I kind of assume more of these legends sometimes would go out with just a really clunker of a year, but it seems like almost every that we're going to detail here, went out with a pretty decent year. They're not like the baseball player that's, hitting under 200 and unplayable or whatever. Well, these guys are unplayable. They're all pretty damn good so far, so it's pretty cool. But yeah, no, other than Boston not really being a great team, a decent last year. I know his final game though, I think he shot something like 29 points, like shot like 30 times in that game or something like that. Some ridiculous number, but other than that, he stayed pretty under control. So
yeah, well, we'll give him we'll give him a little slack for it being his last game. And
yeah, the team sucks. I'm gonna do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah,
so
so
I want enough. I want a goddamn enough titles. I don't need just let me shoot. Just want to go out one time shooting.
There's a good anecdote about from Slam Magazine talking about it's sort of a profile Havlicek in that You're talking about the sort of the only interest of that season was farewell tour because they were so bad. He arrived at the game in a tuxedo. I believe the Celtics gave him a camper at halftime. There was like this big 9-minute ceremony where he's like standing there and they're all kind of like celebrating him. And
he doesn't need the camper. Everybody gave him appliances.
Yeah. So he both the appliances for the camper.
Do those? I don't know. Do those work at those well, or do you need special camper appliances? I've never owned a camper.
Maybe they gave him a converter. Whatever you might. I think the appliances were.
I don't know. Yeah, see, I don't know. I don't know if there's special plugs or something.
So he shot 33 times in that game actually.
Okay, all right.
And the Celtics were in control throughout. They were playing the Buffalo Braves, which will be important in a moment. And as the clock wound down, the crowd really got into it. Ernie DeGregorio, who was a pretty famous, he had a very short-lived career due to injury, but he was a very popular mid-70s point guard playing for the Buffalo Braves. After the injury, he had played a little bit for the Lakers and then a little bit for the Celtics. This was his final game as well. He was in the game for Boston, and he was basically every time he was passing it to Havlicek. And then the writer compared it to Hondo had begun his career catching passes from Bob Cousy, and now he was ending it by catching passes from the only player alive who saw the game the way the Coos did. In one 11-second span, Ernie D twice found Havlicek on sneakaways. He scored 9 lightning points to an amazing roar, finishing with 29, a phenomenal farewell. So the interesting thing about his final game, it was also this would be the final game for the Buffalo Braves as they would move to San Diego after the season was done. And it was the same day that David Thompson scored 73 and George Griffin scored 63 points to, for their duel for the scoring title for
a lot of unabashed chucking on this.
Yes,
on this day.
Exactly. So
Kobe Bryant would be proud of this.
Yeah, there you go.
The day he can.
Exactly. So, so that is definitely an interesting day in NBA history. But yeah, and one thing that to sort of tie in both the Havlicek and Erving tours is that they are obviously them along with Kareem are the most famous, or at least the examples that I can find, the most prominent examples of actually like having a tour and having these gifts and having like this, thing. And with Kareem, the interesting thing is like, with Erving and Havlicek, it didn't really necessarily matter because they were not, they weren't really playing for anything. Their teams were not good. I guess Erving's was a playoff team, but, they weren't like a championship contender. And Havlicek was nothing. But Kareem was on a, NBA Finals, the team that ended up going to the finals and had championship aspirations. So he talked a lot about how it was really a big distraction for him to like go sort of through those ceremonies and to sort of like be standing like for 10 minutes and to, be kind of cold and, just kind of stand still and not be warming up. And, it sort of he felt like it affected sort of how he played and his season that year was far below his usual standards. And actually, they set a limit for those ceremonies because of how like Julius Erving had gone for so long that they were like, okay, we need to set a time to make these not interesting. But it's interesting that after Kareem's was done, there really was not another one on a major scale, at least that I can find. And part of it is we talked about Jordan's retirement. Magic's, he had to retire because of HIV, so his was sudden. Bird didn't, his last year, he wasn't, I think his decision didn't come until after the Olympics, his announcement, at least his final decision, I think came before them, but wasn't necessarily assured during the season. And he wasn't maybe necessarily the type to have that kind of pomp and circumstance. So that you wouldn't think Kareem would be either. The Kareem's sort of the interesting one because you think that sort of goes against his personality to a degree, but but just the way it goes. So, but it is kind of interesting that we've never at least, I don't know. I don't think you found one either where we found one where it was like, oh yeah, this guy is definitely going, out this season and it's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, no, there's not really any. I mean, there's a guy we're going to talk about here in a little bit that's probably comes the closest, but even then it wasn't. It's still very. Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, you look at the stars in the '90s, and I guess we'll talk about him when we talk about this guy. But yeah, it's really hard to find until. Yeah, I'm trying to. This might be the. trying to think if there's anybody that strikes me. Maybe that Jordan Tour,
I mean, Reggie Miller, he announced.
Yeah, there was
a little.
Yeah.
His announcement came before the end of the season. But I think that was more just a big deal in Indiana, and not necessarily a big deal about with nationally. Because I mean, that was the same season the Malice of the Palace Brawl. So
yeah, that was a good team. I mean, they probably had bigger focuses. I mean, that team was built to go to the finals. I mean, that was a good team at that time. Everybody was ready to go. Like that was the main focus I remember of that year, is that Reggie was going to retire, and everybody was like, all right, cool. Instead, like, let's win this for, let's get to the finals for Reggie, or let's win a title for Reggie, versus like let's give Reggie things. That was a real deal team at that point.
Yeah, I mean, but after the Mouse and the Palace, that wasn't going to happen. But before then, yes, that absolutely was sort of the case. So that was just kind of a weird year, a weird vibe around that team.
And Ewing, of course, is a famous one that just retired. Got a Supersonic or a Magic. It was Magic, right? It was
but that was his came after the season, so
right, yeah. And then even then, it was just kind of like real sad at that point.
Yeah.
So even then, it would have been like kind of weird to like even do it. But yeah, you go through the bunch, and Hakeem, we'll talk about him in here a little bit.
There isn't really much to say. I mean, other than he just basically played his final season with the Raptors after 17 years in Houston, and then was
all the '90s guys seem to at least bounce like one more time before they were all the way
right. The guys who you would think might get that sort of circumstance didn't really get it because they ended up being on different teams. Or
if Hakeem was in Houston, I don't have any doubt that there would have been something.
Yeah,
but
I mean they had a ceremony in Houston after, but it wasn't it wasn't the same kind of thing. So so next, now this is sort of a different category, but I just thought it was too interesting to not mention. This is Jerry West, and he retired in after the 74 season, and there wasn't any kind of a farewell tour, but basically he just announced it. I guess actually in fall of 74, so before the 75 season, he announced it. This came after a pretty bad year for him. He did not play well that year.
Yeah, and that final year, he just played in just 31 games, so didn't play a lot of games. We'll get to that here in a little bit. Scoring wise, not terrible, 20.3 points per game, 6.6 assists per game, which are pretty low for him, but not too bad. Career worst, 3.2 win shares, and his second worst ever win shares per 48 of 0.159. Yeah. So not a terrible win share per 48 number, but it's not bad. But overall though, it just wasn't the Jerry West of old in a lot of ways.
Sure,
and health wise. And just numerous ways as well. But it's probably the worst one we've talked about yet in terms of seasons, but still interesting.
Yeah, and the two most interesting things about this is that West was like the Lakers had three all-time greats retire in three straight seasons. I mean, Elgin Baylor retired during the 72 season before they won the championship. He played like 11 games that year and was just done. And then Wilt retired after the 73 season, and then West retired after the 74 season. So that's just like it's sort of an incredible thing if you think about it. I mean, those are basically three of the top five greats of their of that generation, and they all retire on the same team within a very short period of time.
Right.
And then West, he was eventually sued by the team for not fulfilling his contract. It was a $6 million lawsuit. Actually, I guess he had sued Jack Kent Cooke, the owner, after they wouldn't honor the contract, and they said that he retired, so we shouldn't honor the contract, feeling like he could have played, and he said no, I couldn't play or whatever. So anyway, he withdraws the lawsuit, and part of the terms of that are that he became the coach of the team.
That's so weird. The forced coach. That's just
yes, and he replaced Bill Sharman, who went into the front office and was an important aspect of front office in building the next great Lakers team. That was right when that was 76 season. That was right around the time that they got Kareem. I think Kareem was the only if I'm not mistaken, West was Kareem's first coach, or if not, it was close after that. So and the Lakers kind of coaching was not necessarily a West forte. They sort of, it was basically a give the ball to Kareem and let him work kind of thing. Which I mean,
that's not a bad strategy.
No,
yeah,
but
right?
I mean, the lack of variety was kind of an issue. He just didn't have the temperament for coaching. I mean, he admitted this kind of in his book, that he wasn't necessarily like the guy who was, meant to do that. But I just thought that was like that's such a 70s NBA story. That basically to end a lawsuit, he becomes coach of the team. So
it's like a movie. There's got to be like some campy 80s or 90s movie where somebody has to become the coach of a team or whatever.
Yes,
and I mean that's perfect. Maybe they should make the adaptation of the Jerry West story.
I like his quote of like, "I wouldn't be here unless my suit had been dropped." Was said and. I don't know. This is funny. It's a UPI story, and this is like the most boring quote ever. I spoke to Mr. Cook yesterday morning. He said he would call me back in the afternoon. He called me back in the afternoon, congratulated me. So it was finalized yesterday.
Jeez, thrilling.
Yes, that was a good. I had to have had that one, I guess.
And then I filled out paperwork, and then it was official.
Yes, there you go.
Cool. Tell us more.
Again, no, like, this is a different category, but I just thought was sort of interesting. And then one more that also doesn't really fit, but I just thought was interesting because of kind of the contrast on how they were, on how they both went out with their links together. John Stockton and Karl Malone. Stockton retired in 2003, and then Malone went to the Lakers to chase after a championship, and he was injured toward the end of that, or he was injured in the regular season, then was injured again in the playoffs, and didn't get that championship for him. Ended up that being his final season, although I remember in 2005 there was like some talk that he might like come back and join the Spurs, but that obviously never happened. But interesting that neither guy ever got that true send-off.
No, yeah, neither of them did. And this one in particular, there's a YouTube video showing the final minutes of this game. It was the Jazz losing a playoff series to the Kings. And the announcers kind of very heavily say, this might be it for Stockton. And, all the players on the Kings sort of go over there and kind of say hi and, give handshakes to him. And the camera's fixated on Stockton the entire time. But it's never really explicit. And then after, they have the post-game press conference and, the reporter, the first question out of the gates is, is this it? Are you retiring? He goes, I don't know. In perfect, if you ever heard Stockton do an interview, he's like, maybe, I don't know. I haven't thought of it or whatever. And then in this particular YouTube video, then there's like a news broadcast that's like the next day, when he finally gets into Utah or whatever. And his quote in perfect Stocktonian fashion is, "I think I'm finished." Like in that tone too. They're like, all right, John, like, what did you have to say? Because he calls this like not a press conference, but it's like in the locker room. And yeah, he just says, "I think I am finished." So he says that he informed everybody on the team plane and all that sort of stuff, and that that was going to be it for him. So like it really wasn't a very good send off. Watching that video, it's just like, man, that's the end of John Stockton. Like. The season-wise, I mean, and he even admits in the post-game press conference, too, that, I wasn't happy with how I played this year. I wasn't a good contributor to the team. He wasn't too bad. I mean, 10.8 points per game was fairly low for him, but 7.7 assists per game, still pretty good. 48% shooting, not bad at all. 9 win shares, like really damn good. And then a 0.91 win shares per 48, which are like, for a 40-year-old, are like shockingly good. So, other than his scoring kind of and probably a lot of his athleticism, he was still, Stockton was still a decent player. But yeah, you can sort of tell from that post-game press conference in that game that it was probably going to be it for him. And then, of course, does it. But yeah, he didn't really get a great send-off, and neither did Malone. And probably the most tragic part of that is they didn't really do it in Utah. They didn't get, a real good send-off from them. They mentioned in one article that, Stockton almost immediately after got they named a street after him outside the Delta Center. The next year they went and retired, his number or whatever, but it just didn't feel like a send off worthy of a guy who, played his entire career in Utah and that sort of stuff. But knowing John Stockton, that's probably about what he would have wanted anyway.
Yeah.
He would have been the most awkward guy ever to here's like a cigar. And he'd be like, he'd be like shivering while it's happening. Like, just let me play. I just want to play basketball. So I get it. It's fine for him. And I'm sure this is the exact way he wanted to go out, and I don't blame him.
Yeah, and it's it's interesting, because Malone and Stockton obviously were together for 18 years, had basically a whole generation of fans, knew success through them, and they were the most important. I mean, they still are the most important players in that franchise's history by far. basically established it after it had been a joke of a franchise for a decade. Just really laid that foundation. So for them to kind of not get that was a little disappointing, and maybe contributes a little bit to why I think Stockton and Malone maybe aren't like quite as appreciated as they should be. Especially Malone, who is really has a case, and I don't think he is, but I think he certainly has a case of being the greatest power forward ever.
Yeah.
And certainly was that when he retired, and with Duncan coming right after him, and with Malone and Stockton never getting past Jordan, and all that stuff sort of works against them. But they were very close to a championship or multiple championships. They had this incredible longevity, and they were great. I don't think any tandem of players has been as great together longer and later in their career. I mean, even
it's astonishing how long that they were together and how successful they were. We have a future show coming up where we're going to talk about, the number 2 team in the 90s. And in doing that, I did a lot of research on Utah. And it's you sort of think, oh yeah, they in the late 90s they popped up and faced the Bulls. I mean, that team was damn good for a decade plus, right, with those two guys as pretty much the only, there were some parts in and here, in there and out there, but I mean, it's those two dudes. I mean, that's it. I mean, that is really, there's not another star that popped up, on those Utah teams, very much. I mean, there's little guys here and there, but yeah, that's those two guys that basically every single year that team was going to win 55 games, almost guaranteed, at least 50 every single year for 15 a decade plus or whatever, and that's profound. I mean, that's it's important.
Yes. Yeah. There were a couple others that we just were a very, very quick mention. We talked about him a little bit before, but Elvin Hayes, he reached the 5,000 minutes milestone for a tanking Rockets team, and then that was it for him. Hal Greer for the 76ers. He was the lone holdout from the 1967 title team, one of the greatest individual single seasons of all time with Wilt. Ended his career on the bench on a 9-win team. There's a story from Perfectly Awful, which is the book Charlie Rosen wrote on that team, and basically Hal Greer wasn't playing in there, and then the coach is like, hey, you want to get into this game? He's like, yeah, no, I'm not in shape. It's not going to happen. So and the fans are in there, kind of begging for him to want to, just have him go in one time and, and be this guy who's, this legend for this team and is this last link to this great team. And of course the 9-win Sixers are the worst team ever. And it's just just a sad coda to, a tremendously terrible season. And then Jason Kidd, who retired from the Knicks after failing to make a basket, I believe, in his last 10 games. And
God, that was bad.
Yeah, I think he was 0 for 20 or something like that. And then then he immediately became coach of the Nets. And then there was this great home, this homecoming story. And the Nets were going to be really good. They'd gotten Garnett and Pierce, and they were going to team up, with Darren Williams. And, there was a lot of optimism there about them, being a title contender and all that. And, his number was retired right away. And it was this big, it looks like all these pieces were going to come together. And then they were terrible to start. They ended up being better, but ended up, being disappointing in that season. And then they had a terrible, ugly breakup over that next summer. And now it's not so much I guess the final season as it is the aftermath of that. But that's just, interesting the way that worked out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then Hakeem Olajuwon is another one we talked about a little bit. But yeah, of course, played the final season with the Raptors after so many years in Houston. And yeah, just it wasn't the same thing. And I imagine it would have been a lot different if he stuck with Houston the whole way through. But, he was, to be fair, though, that team was good, that Toronto Raptors team. So that was a little bit of one of the interesting parts, is that he was sort of chasing, an NBA Finals berth or something like that. But yeah, it didn't end up happening.
Yeah. That announcement came during training camp the next year. So, and then he went to Houston and they had the announcement, and then that's, but it's still, again, not as much of the saying goodbye part, was.
Yeah, he's absolutely a guy that I think probably could have and should have deserved it had he stayed in Houston the entire time, or at least had he announced it, ahead of time. I think he was, because I think that's another guy, at least in Houston, was a transcendent sort of guy for that franchise. But wasn't to be.
He won back-to-back championships. Yeah, I mean, it absolutely was really important. So, but we don't all get like I said. It's very rare for the actual farewell tour to come about. So Kobe, you're blessed. It'll be yeah, exactly. It'll be interesting to see if. I can't imagine Duncan really having one. Dirk, maybe I could see that.
Dirk's going to have one.
I feel like the Mavericks are the type of franchise that's going to try to make a big deal about that. So I could see that one standing out and him kind of getting that, that last hurrah kind of thing.
And he seems like a guy who kind of yuck it up a little bit too and enjoy it. I mean, people sort of think he's a very stoic guy, but he's a fun-loving dude.
Oh yeah,
He'll love it. He really will have a lot of fun with that. So.
Yeah, that'll be fun when that comes. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone for checking us out. You can find us at HarvardParoxysm.com, and we are part of the HP Basketball Network. You can find our podcast on iTunes. Either search for Over and Back for our individual feed, or search for Harvard Paroxysm Network for the group of podcasts. Please leave a rating and or review. That'd be a wonderful way to let people know about us and to spread the word about our podcast if you're into it. Also, you can check out our forums over and back NBA.com. It's a good discussion of NBA history there. And you can find us on Twitter and Facebook at Over and Back NBA. So until next time, thanks for listening, and we'll be back again soon.